Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Apocalypse here. Christianity you can live with. It's been a while, and what I'm wanting to do today is just sort of pick up on the series I had been doing on McCormack's book, The Humility of the Eternal Son. Last time, way back when, I was talking about chapter 3. So go back and look at that video on chapter 3, which is up on YouTube. I am going to give a little bit of a recap to start off, but it's not going to be sufficient for you to really get at what I'm going to be moving into now. So just a brief recap on this chapter on Barth and Balthazar. Barth, according to McCormack, had really good intentions, and he almost got there. But where his Christology ended up made it impossible for him to say anything other than really that the christological subject is the pre-existent logos as such. So he couldn't quite make the move to say that the christological subject in both time and eternity is composite. In addition to Barth and Balthazar, we also have Bulgakov, who's an important figure in this chapter that I failed to mention when I was just introducing this. Bulgakov's mistake, according to McCormack, was his sort of speculative approach, especially his sophiology as understood to kind of mediate revelation between absolute and absolute relative. In addition to this, his understanding of kenosis in the Father. Balthazar, as I talked about, went this same sort of way with kenosis in terms of the Father, it's not really what Philippians 2 is doing. Okay, which is where a lot of this self-emptying stuff sort of arises from. It's not talking about the Father specifically. For McCormack, Balthazar needed to pay closer attention to the christological subject, like Barth did, although Barth didn't go all the way, as a composite person, both in eternity and time. The abandonment experienced by Jesus isn't proper to the eternal generation, but is a human experience communicated to the Logos and taken up into God's life in a way that God has already always been receptive to. Now, so chapter 4, where McCormack talks about some of the Post-Barthians. The way that I've labeled this video is, are the Post-Barthians right? And this has sort of been the way that I have been approaching things in terms of what I have found to be compelling prior to reading McCormack's book, especially with Robert Jensen, who we're going to talk about. I really thought that Jensen was offering the solution, and now I'm not so sure. As Barth was nearing his death in 1968, theologians were wanting to find new ways forward from Barth's Christology, especially ones grounded in eschatology. Eschaton meaning end, ology just meaning sort of words about stuff, so end stuff. So an account of Christology that is grounded in eschatology, end stuff, in the God of the future, which hoped to prevent history from being evacuated of real significance. In addition to this, theologians started realizing that classical Christological categories seem to kind of occlude important features of Jesus's narrated history in the New Testament witness. That Jesus was actually a real concrete human being with rational capacities, and that he could truly be spoken of as our brother and our friend. And this is why, quote-unquote, post-Barthian makes sense as a designation for these figures. Okay? I would consider myself something of a post-Barthian, but not so much in this camp anymore. I don't quite know how to align myself with these figures. But these figures are wanting to move beyond Barth's shortcomings, which I do too, and the shortcomings that we talked about in the previous video, while also maintaining a deep appreciation and use of Barth's dogmatics. Wolfhart Pannenberg and Jürgen Moltmann, who may be familiar theologians to you, were two key figures in this regard. initially. And they sort of made possible the work of the two theologians that we're going to be talking today. I'm going to kind of bracket off one of them, namely two Lutherans, Robert Jensen and Eberhard Jüngel. Schoenberg, fascinating person. I'm just not going to devote the time for that in this video, unfortunately. In general, Jensen and Jüngel were rather allergic to protological concerns, so stuff to do at the beginning, because of their ontological ground in eschatology, in the end stuff. What resulted in what McCormack calls the interlocking temptation of these post-Barthians was the collapse of the second person of the Trinity into Jesus Christ. The idea that the imminent Trinity was only really complete in the future, as well as the claim that kenosis was something that only takes place in Jesus without pretemporal grounding, okay, without pressure coming from before the foundation of the world. So we're going to start with Jüngel. He was one of the most important and accurate interpreters of Karl Barth to ever exist. Jüngel saw Barth, and in his thinking, the importance of the humanity of God, and made it the basis of his own Christology. Okay, because of Jüngel's mastery of Barth's thought, he was able to see certain aspects of it that not even Barth and Barth's own students could see with clarity, especially in Barth's doctrine of revelation and election. On the topic of revelation, Jüngel saw in Barth, against these sort of abstract metaphysical conceptions of pure being, an account of God's being as a gift, and being gifted in this revelation became important. We actually encounter God's very essence in revelation, according to Jüngel. It's not something else. God's being is located in the event of his self-revelation. So Barth adds to the description of pure act, actus purus, he adds to that et singularis. God is his singular act of revelation, with nothing proper to God being left behind or beyond God when he arrives as a human being, which is something important to hang on to. Another angle on this would be that God corresponds to himself and thereby repeats himself in Revelation. So Jüngel sees in Barth that, quote, the inner Trinitarian relations provide the ontological condition in God for the possibility of what God will do in time. But why and how does this finally make sense? How is it that God in time is ontologically grounded in God's self-relation? Enter Barth's doctrine of election. One of Barth's innovations to do with the reformed account of election that he had received is to say that God is the primary object of election and is also its subject, electing to be this sort of God for humanity and for the cosmos. So election should be understood as self-determination. Okay? It's God's self-determination, a singular, eternal act of God that points both inward and outward. What do I mean by that? Inward, in the sense that the event differentiates the modes of being in God, in Barth's language. So it's sort of coterminous with Trinitarian processions. So it differentiates those modes of being. And outward, in the sense that Jesus of Nazareth is, quote, proper to the eternal being of God. So unlike other construals of election as a sort of contingent decision, choosing among different options, right? For Barth, it is an act of self-determination that makes its content essential to God. So it contains a strong sense of divine immutability, right? God's freedom is God's decision to be this sort of God who has his being in this act of election alone. God wasn't in heaven sort of deliberating among different options, only to land on one, because this would make freedom an ontological precondition in any sort of choice, a sort of add-on to God. With respect to Jüngel's own theology, he makes a significant change here from Barth. The act of God's self-determination occurs for Jüngel not, as Barth had it, in pretemporal eternity, but in history. Okay? So Jüngel will place this in history and ultimately in the eschaton. And Jüngel deploys further a retroactive ontology, an account of being that's sort of backward looking, with its ground in the future, so in eschatology, which we're going to talk about more. Jüngel's basic christological question is, where is God? Where is God? For him, it is in his unity with perishable people. His unity with perishable people. That's where God is. It is established where God makes himself known as, quote, the union of death and life for the sake of life, end quote. But Jüngel will also expand on this to talk about God as love. Now, usually the sort of relation between God and love is taken more to mean that God has love, okay? Which would, of course, leave the door open to committing to the idea that God's being isn't actually love. It's something God possesses. But for Jüngel, theology must treat the statement God is love on the basis of history, on the basis of God's being in history, in the event of love that God is. And this event consists in the union of death and life for the sake of life, as Jüngel likes to say quite often. But now when God relates in this way, Jüngel will sort of speak about this in terms of an I-thou relationship. It must surrender to it, according to him, that it ceases to have itself. So God, sort of as the I, ceases to have itself in its relation to the thou. But for Jüngel, this introduces a new kind of nearness, right? We would think that would be separation, but for him, it introduces nearness, a, quote, very great self-relatedness in the midst of a still greater selflessness, end quote. So fundamentally, in God's act of identification with Jesus, God's being realizes itself as love in that relation. This is where Jüngel's sort of Christology, as McCormack puts it, and its doctrine of the Trinity find their ontological root. In this event of identification, God differentiates himself in that he loves himself. He is God the Father and God the Son. But we find here that God does not desire to simply love himself without loving and offering himself for his creatures. So in God's self-communication and self-emptying to the point of suffering and death, this separates the Father and the Son in some sense. But Jüngel will continue on with this sort of paradoxical thinking. This separation also contains a unity within it, which is eventually realized in the resurrection, the overcoming of that separation, right? So that's why a lot of this is coming from the future. Ultimately, this is realized in a resurrected location. This means for Jüngel that the hypostatic union is the completion, the culmination of God's self-identification. Now, McCormack drills down into Jüngel's account of this sort of significance of Jesus's death in God-forsakenness, where the death seems to separate Father and Son. What happens to the love that we were just talking about in that separation? Right? Seems like a pretty obvious question. Predictably, Jüngel goes to the Holy Spirit as love itself, okay? Who for him preserves the unity of the two in their separation. He further describes the Spirit as the eternal newness, according to which God is always his own future. So what happens here is that the triunity of God is constituted in the event of God identifying with Christ crucified and the Spirit's sort of love-preserving role, which sort of grounds things in the future, right? To quote McCormack on Jüngel, the God who is love is totally identical with his essence in his existence. His existence is his essence, end quote. But McCormack points out where Jüngel is going wrong, according to him. With respect to Jüngel's retroactive ontology coming from the future, really, especially once you introduce the spirit, and with its connection to life absorbing death into itself, McCormack worries that this approach runs into problems of intelligibility. Jüngel sees the resurrection as that which makes Jesus to be God, ultimately. But, as McCormack writes, if it is the resurrection that is, in the first and most primordial sense, the act of identification that makes Jesus to be God, then the idea that God absorbs death on the cross by being the subject of it puts tremendous burden on the idea of retroactive ontological significance. In death, Jesus as a human being is made to have been God, and the subject who absorbs death only retrospectively or retroactively, end quote. The problem with this is that what happens in the crucifixion isn't an event in God's life until God has already overcome it in the resurrection. And of course, McCormack sees ontological receptivity as avoiding this, which he's spelled out in brief before, and will sort of unpack as we go forward. Lastly, on Jüngel, he parts ways entirely with divine immutability, without really questioning whether or not the received classical conception of the term is correct, as controlled by kind of apathy and absoluteness. For McCormack, only a different account of divine being in protology can be the way forward. We don't just need to abandon divine immutability. And I'll explain a bit about this at the end to kind of summarize McCormack's complaints about both Jüngel and Jensen. Like with Jüngel, McCormack begins his discussion of Jensen with what Jensen took from Barth and where he sort of ended up parting from him. Jensen, like Barth, but in a different way, wants a christologically grounded understanding of God and humanity. But Jensen is wary of any appeal to pretemporal eternity, so protology, something Barth was not concerned about because he sees it as suggesting that, quote, all has been decided. This is quoting McCormack, all has been decided from the beginning. A conviction that, in Jensen's view, reduces the God of the Bible to the God of the past and leaves no room for the God of the future, for indeterminacy, etc. So Jensen essentially cuts off protology to suggest that what happens in Jesus, the happening of God himself, is Jesus' obedience to his Father in giving himself to humanity. So let's unpack this. Jensen talks about Maximus the Confessor at this point as opening in Christology a way to sort of treat the divine will in the God-human as identical with the will of all members in the Godhead. What this meant for Jensen was that we should now see that the willing of the God-human is simply Jesus' willing as he participates in that divine life. Something I found really, really compelling. And I still kind of do. Jesus alone is active. The hypostasis involved just is both natures. It is each and both. Okay? It's simply a description of the divine and human Jesus. Connecting with Jesus alone being active, we can see where Jensen is positioned christologically. A pre-existent son or word is no longer in play. The man Jesus is the Son and the Word. But does Jensen have any conception at all of Jesus' pre-existence? That's a key question, which Jensen readily answers in his own way. For Jensen, Jesus doesn't really need to be ontologically pre-existent to his own birth. Jesus' pre-existent is the infinity of life that he lives with the Father in the Spirit. It's in that infinity in life alone that Christ can be said to precede himself. This life with the Father and the Spirit requires a retroactive ontology coming from the future. But Jensen does locate Jesus, the Son's antecedents. There is something coming prior to Jesus, specifically in Israel's narrated history in the Old Testament. Pre-existence is strictly this worldly for Jensen. He talks about Jesus going to be born, okay, with Jesus mediating God to those in the OT narratives and prophecies. But what this ends up meaning is that for Jensen, there is no logos asarkos. Okay? By that I mean there is no word without flesh. Making Jesus' relation to the Father, his being sent and his obedience, to be the same thing as the second hypostasis of the Trinity. There really isn't a hypostatic union here, nor a kenosis that can be described as having an ontological precondition in the incarnation, like we had with Barth and Bulgakov and von Balthasar. And of course, there's no divine immutability either, since God's suffering in Jesus is in fact something new and unanticipated. Ultimately, what's happened in Jensen is that he's collapsed the eternal generation of the Son into Jesus' conception by the Holy Spirit in time. Okay? Yes, you have antecedents in Israel's history, but really the generation happens in the conception of Jesus by the Spirit in time. So we're left with a few of McCormack's thoughts on the Post-Barthians. I'm going to go over two that I think are most important. So why is the collapse? This is something I've wondered. Why is the collapse of the eternal Son into Jesus a mistake? Why is that problematic, really? So McCormack gives some suggestions there. One, it makes God mutable. McCormack recounts a question that he received from Jürgen Moltmann at a conference, which basically amounted to, like, why not just go with the mutable God? Which is something I have thought. But for McCormack, and this has been helpful to me, going with the mutable God undermines hope. God's unchangingness is the basis for Christian confidence that God really is going to be unwaveringly faithful and conquer this world of evil, and will in fact bring an eschatological future where reality is freed from bondage. And I would add a little bit more directly, it leaves the door open for God to turn around and act as a fundamentally different God. Why couldn't he? He could turn around and punish everyone if he wanted to. So, to quote McCormack, mutability in God introduces an element of the arbitrary into God's work ad extra, of ad hoc reaction to events as they unfold, end quote. So a mutable God gives us no assurance concerning how he will act in events, making the promised future that we hold on to as Christians to, quote, hang in the air, according to McCormack. 2. McCormack has concerns for ecumenical relations among Christians. If dogmatic Christology is going to have any ecumenical purchase, we can't just dispense of a duality in Christ, especially given that classical theism tends to dominate this discussion. It just sets you up for a bad dialogue and a bad debate, which I may be guilty of, making it less likely that you'll be heard. And this is important because all the theologians that McCormack has already talked about are in real danger of being forgotten today. So it's important for McCormack that we're able to communicate this history and its concepts well, if we actually care about them, and I do. So this has been the summary of chapter 4 of McCormack's book. I hope this was helpful. It's a bit complicated. I would advise that you listen to previous videos that I've made on this book, and then also pick up the book, read it for yourself. It's been a joy for me, and I'm glad that I'm just now sort of getting back into making videos on this. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know if you have any questions about this. You can leave them in the comment section. That's really helpful. But most especially, put a like down if you wouldn't mind. With that, this has been Apocalypse here. Christianity you can live with. Thanks, everyone.